There we go, Logan.
Hey, good morning, everyone. So can you hear me okay? Excellent. Well, it's a delight to be here and to have this chance to share some of the work that we've been spearheading at NAU with the help of a wide cast of other collaborators across the Arctic, especially Matt McAnder, which is great to see him here, and hopefully help field some of the more nuanced Landsat data processing questions if any arise. So let me share my presentation with you all. Okay, did that pop up?
Yes, looking good.
Excellent. So this is work that, I'm spearheading with the help of Kathleen Orendal at NAU. And so she's taking on a lot of the satellite remote sensing data processing components of this. And we're getting a lot of help from a research scientist, Pat Burns at NAU, as well as Matt McAnder, Scott Getz, and a variety of other people. So this has been a big team effort to start developing these next generation biomass maps. So I thought I'd give a little bit of kind of impetus for why it is that we're interested in developing a better understanding of plant biomass distribution and change across the Arctic, and then get into some of the approaches that we've been using to develop these new biomass maps. So I think it comes as no surprise to anyone here in the room that the Arctic is warming, 3 to 4 times faster than the rest of the planet. The figure on the right shows the average summer warmth index, kind of a growing degree days style calculation for the Arctic tundra biome based on 6 global temperature data sets. And you can see that since the 1880s, the mean summer warmth index increased from about 20 degrees Celsius now to up over 30 degrees Celsius, with especially rapid warming since the 1960s and 1980s. And while this has happened, we've seen a myriad ecological impacts. So one of the most evident ones has been an expansion of shrubs across these northern landscapes. So for example, the pair of photos on the left show this landscape in northern Alaska in 1948, and then a repeat photo from 2001. And you can see, comparing those photos, that there's been an expansion of alder shrubs, both within the drainage path coming down the hillside, as well as in the foregrounds. Now, when people have gone out and done these repeat photos, they found extensive increase in shrubification, not only in northern Alaska, but also using other techniques from across the Arctic. So in a recent paper, we reviewed the scientific literature focused on kind of shrubification in the north. And so that's what's shown in the map in the middle. Sorry, doorbell. So the blue dots in this map show where there's been an increase in shrub cover, growth, biomass, or reproduction over the last half century to a century, depending on the study. And you can see that there's blue dots scattered across much of northern Alaska and Canada, parts of Greenland, and also extensively across Eurasia as well. The dots in yellow, red, and purple show where there's been other responses, whether stable or decreasing shrubbiness. But by and large, we see this preponderance of evidence pointing towards the Arctic becoming much shrubbier. As that's happened, we've also seen a long-term increase in vegetation greenness as measured by Earth-observing satellites. So this map shows the change in annual maximum vegetation greenness from 1982 to 2020 using the AVHRR satellites and the normalized difference vegetation index as a metric of vegetation greenness. And again, we find that there's extensive greening, especially across northern Alaska and the low Arctic in Canada, as well as across much of Eurasia as well. There are areas that have browned during this time, but they're fairly uncommon in comparison to the widespread greening that's occurred within this domain. And we see these greening trends not only with the AVHR satellites, but also with newer, higher resolution, better calibrated satellites, such as the MODIS satellites. So that this map on the right then shows the changes in vegetation greenness from 2000 to 2021. And these are figures that were put together by J.D. Frost and Matt McCander and Emma Bott as part of the NOAA Arctic Report Card in 2021. Now, if we look at kind of average conditions across the Arctic, what we find is that there's been this increase in the average NDVI or vegetation greenness since the 1980s, not only for the Arctic overall, as shown in this black line in the time series on the left-hand side, but also within each of the individual Arctic zones, the high Arctic, the low Arctic, and the oral Arctic. So this is kind of the colloquial greening of the Arctic that has received quite a bit of attention. Now, we know that at a very large spatial scale, this greening trend tends to correspond with rising summer air temperatures. So the figure on the right shows the scatter plot relationship between the average NDVI anomaly for the whole Arctic tundra biome compared to the average summer warmth anomaly for the whole biome. And each one of those dots is a year from 1985 up to 2016. Points are color-coded by the year in which, or by the decade in which the measurements were made. And you can see that through time, all the points have kind of shifted up and to the right, such that this 2010s decade and 2016 in particular were the warmest and the greenest decade or year when averaged across the whole biome when looking back over the last 4 decades. So at least at a very broad swath, this Arctic greening is tied back to large-scale changes in climate. We know that Arctic greening also is linked to an increase in plant and shrub biomass. So this kind of jumble of figures just shows a bunch of relationships that people have found in comparing NDVI on the x-axis against above ground biomass, either total plant biomass or shrub biomass on the y-axis. So we see pretty strong relationships emerging between AVHRR NDVI and total plant biomass, between field measurements of NDVI and shrub biomass, between Landsat-derived estimates of NDVI, and both plant and total shrub biomass. And so this is looking across field sites, not through time. But it does point towards the fact that these metrics of vegetation greenness that we've used a lot to understand Arctic environmental change do track back to underlying changes in plant biomass. But you can see that these are very nonlinear relationships. And so it makes it challenging to understand or interpret how a trend in NDVI necessarily translates into a change in plant biomass across the. So plant biomass is a fundamental ecosystem metric, right? It influences things like habitat suitability for wildlife, how much deciduous willow is there available for this little cute baby moose at the edge of the boreal forest, hoping to creep out up into the Arctic tundra as it becomes shrubbier. Plant biomass is important for how people utilize and move across northern landscapes as well. Moreover, plant biomass is considered to be an essential climate variable by the World Meteorological Organization, due to its influence not only on surface albedo and reflectance, but also because plants store a tremendous amount of carbon, and also influence the roughness of these northern landscapes and landscapes around the planet. But despite its importance, plant biomass is highly uncertain across the Arctic tundra biome. So, for example, the one map of plant biomass that we have for the whole Arctic tundra biome was derived back around 2012 and is based on AVHRR NDVI imagery that has a spatial resolution of about 8 or 10 kilometers per pixel. Now, the map shown on the left is what that distribution of biomass looks like across the Arctic, I think for the year 2010. Now, the map was derived based on this nonlinear relationship between NDVI and above ground biomass, which is shown in that scatter plot in the top right. And you can see that that relationship is very tight at this scale, and with kind of a very selective sampling of vegetation locations. But you can also notice that it's constrained only by about 12 field sites, with a transect across Eastern Eurasia and another one across Northern North America. So while this map really has provided this new level of understanding about the distribution of plant biomass across the Arctic, it nevertheless is very coarse spatial resolution. It's based on very limited field sampling. And it doesn't necessarily tell us anything about the composition of vegetation in these areas either. Now, folks, Howie Epstein and colleagues took this NDVI biomass relationship and they applied it back through the ABHRR time series. And they estimated that between 1982 and 2010, that there is about a 20% increase in biomass across the Arctic tundra biome. Right? So that's a massive increase in biomass over a fairly short period of time. Now, we've also been exploring using some newer techniques to map biomass across Arctic tundra systems as well. So we found pretty good success in mapping biomass, total plant community biomass, and shrub biomass across the North Slope of Alaska using the Landsat satellites. So we did a paper back in 2018, and these are the biomass maps that we generated as part of that project, with the top left one showing total plant biomass and the bottom left one showing shrub above ground biomass. And again, these were based on these nonlinear relationships that we saw between Landsat peak summer NDVI and field measurements of plant biomass at around 28 sites across this domain. So these maps provide kind of a level of detail that was, it's not possible with the ABHR satellites. So that these maps will have something like 170,000 times higher spatial resolution than the biomass maps derived from ABHR. But these maps only cover this tiny fraction of the biome in comparison to the biome-wide mapping that was possible back in 2010 with ABHR. But with the Landsat-based maps, we can start resolving finer landscape level variability in the distribution of biomass across these landscapes. So the image on the left is a true color GOI-1 high resolution satellite image of a little area on the North Slope. And then the predicted biomass for plants and shrubs is shown in the figures on the right. And you can see that the maps do a pretty good job of capturing these verdant riparian corridors, for example, and the more barren hilltop ridges. So this work kind of gave us some confidence that we could potentially use the Landsat satellites to develop the next generation of biomass maps for the Arctic. And so that is what we're now doing. So a couple years ago, I wrote a grant proposal to the NASA New Investigator Program that ultimately was funded. And the goal of that project is to quantify the amount, distribution, composition, and recent changes in biomass across the Arctic. And we propose to do this using a combination of field measurements, Landsat data, and kind of ancillary geospatial information. So in particular, we have kind of three primary objectives for this project. The first one is that we need to pull together and standardize existing measurements of plant biomass from across the Arctic. All right, so we want to build this tundra biomass synthesis data set that we can then use to calibrate and validate models linked with Landsat that we can predict across the Arctic. So the second objective then is to model plant biomass across the tundra biome for the years 2000 and 2020. And then the third objective is to evaluate kind of the spatial patterns and changes, where and why did plant biomass change over the last few decades. So for the first objective, we're assembling this ton of biomass from colleagues around the Arctic. And so over the years, people have gone out and they've thrown little quadrats down across sites across the Arctic and have meticulously clipped all of the plant biomass out of these sites, taken those samples back to the lab, dried them, weighed them, and come up with estimates of the oven dry weight of live plants. So we're in particular focused on data sets where we can partition these measurements of plant biomass into 5 functional groups. So we want to be able to say how much biomass was there that came from lichens, bryophytes like mosses, herbaceous vegetation, including grasses, shrubs, and trees. We decided to include trees as well, recognizing that our delineation of the Arctic tundra biome is fairly crude and will kind of inevitably end up mapping across areas that have some trees. And so to be able to make better prediction of biomass in these areas, we also are incorporating or are assembling measurements of tree biomass, which in that case, we're not clipped down and put in a bag, but rather we're inventoried using, and measuring the diameters and heights of trees, and then their biomass was estimated using kind of allometric relationships. So far, we have assembled and standardized 21 individual data sets. These data sets together provide over 10,000 biomass measurements across the 5 plant functional types, and they come from over 2,100 unique harvest plots. The map shows the distribution of these sites that we have currently assembled, and you can see that we have a fair bit of data, high density of data across Alaska. We have some in northern Canada, not really as much as we would like, but it turns out that getting Canadian researchers to share their data has been kind of challenging. We also have extensive data across northern Fennoscandia, Finland, and Sweden. And we have a surprising amount of data from across Russia as well. Now, altogether, we have pulled in 40 collaborators from 24 institutions to contribute these data and to be part of our project. And if we just look at kind of a quick breakdown of biomass distribution by functional type, what we see is that the majority of biomass at these tundra sites is coming from bryophytes and shrubs, and to a lesser extent from lichens, herbaceous vegetation, and to varying extent trees, with a total range of biomass typically less than about 3,000. These figures all cut off the upper 95% of biomass values for improved visual clarity, but we have some sites where the biomass, the total biomass, is upwards of 20,000 grams per square meter, to 20 kilograms per square meter of decently forested sites. But mostly we're operating down the range of 1,000 to maybe 2,000 grams of dry biomass per square meter. So assembling those data, we're now trying to link them up to satellite observations. And our goal, like I mentioned, is to predict plant and shrub above ground biomass for the years 2000 and 2020 at 30-meter resolution across the Arctic tundra biome. And we're doing this primarily using surface reflectance measurements from Landsat 5, 7, and 8. Now, one of the things that we have found in prior work is that there is still this need to cross-calibrate surface reflectance measurements, spectral indices amongst Landsat 5, 7, and 8. So we've come up with a technique to align Landsat 5 and 8 with Landsat 7. In essence, we use Landsat 7 as the benchmark and bring the earlier and later satellites back to that Landsat 7 satellite, which overlaps temporally with the other 2. Now, we recently have finished developing what we're calling the Landsat TS, or the Landsat Time Series software package for R. And so this is a software package that facilitates the extraction of Landsat data from Google Earth Engine from within R. And then it has a suite of functions for cleaning, cross-calibrating, and phenologically modeling Landsat data with the goal of estimating, developing kind of cross-calibrated and phenologically harmonized estimates of vegetation greenness is primarily what we developed it for, but really it can be used for just developing robust surface reflectance time series or other spectral indicity time series. So using the new software, we created a set of polynomial regression models for the Arctic tundra biome that will help snap Landsat 5 and 8 to Landsat 7. So the figures on the bottom show a couple examples of this for NDVI. So the pair of figures on the left show the relationship between Landsat 7 NDVI and Landsat 5 NDVI for the kind of out of the box, what we're calling the uncalibrated, uncross-calibrated data. And you can see that that Landsat 7 NDVI is systematically higher than Landsat 5. Once we run it through the cross-calibration software, we're in essence able to remove that lingering bias from the time series. And we see a similar sort of thing with Landsat 7 versus Landsat 8. So Landsat 8 NDVI tends to be systematically higher than Landsat 7 NDVI. And once we, again, run through the cross-calibration software, it does a pretty good job of removing those lingering biases. And so if you don't do anything about these issues with cross-sensor calibration, if you go to look at the long-term changes, for example, in NDVI across the Arctic, using a time series that combines measurements from each of these 3 satellites, what you'll find is that pretty much everywhere shows a green trend, a long-term increase in vegetation greenness. And that's not a real ecological phenomenon. That's just due to these issues with biases among Logan sensors. So applying these further cross-calibration metrics can be really important, not only for looking at long-term trends in vegetation greenness, but we think also for modeling things like plant biomass, if we want to look at how it's changed in the last 2 decades. So we have a paper that should be coming out very soon in ecography, and it describes the software package, and the software package is available publicly through GitHub as well. Now, we are doing our Landsat data processing using Google Earth Engine. I imagine that most of the people here are familiar with Earth Engine. It's a massively parallelized computing system that Google runs, and it hosts copies of the Landsat archive. And so for this project, we are using 20 years of Landsat data that we are tiling up using an approach that Matt McCander came up with, breaking it into these military reference grids. So each one of those little grids ends up being a chunk of data that we can send to have processed by this high-performance computing system. Now, we found that even with the resources available directly within Earth Engine, we still had to request additional resources from Google to be able to accommodate the large-scale mapping that we're doing. And so we requested what they call an uplift, and they gave us 15 terabytes of storage and access to more processors, so we can have a greater number of compute jobs running at one point in time. And what really necessitated this is that we are looking at Landsat seasonal reflectance as modeled using the CCDC algorithm, the continuous change detection and classification algorithm. So Matt graciously shared with us a processing pipeline that he developed for some of his vegetation cover mapping work as part of NASA BUD. And we are iterating off of that to develop these estimates of surface reflectance at different points during the growing season. And so we have, for example, spring, peak summer, and autumn shown in these 3 figures here. and we're still figuring out exactly what seasonal time periods to focus on. We also have like early summer and late summer as two additional phenological time periods, but it's not clear whether we need those. So fitting these CCDC models and storing the output is very, very computationally intensive. And it really is what necessitated that we get that uplift from Google. Now, we're exploring a suite of predictors to try to estimate plant performance. So in particular, we're looking at the seasonal reflectance predictors, the individual bands, as well as spectral indices. We've also begun evaluating texture metrics, so how spatially variable are some select vegetation indices within like a little neighborhood across the landscape. And then we're also pulling in information on topography. Now, one of the things that we are really trying to do is to find a very parsimonious set of predictors that we can use to model biomass across the Arctic, because there is so much computational demand with the approach that we're using that we want to be sure that we're not kind of overburdening the computing system. Now, we're also exploring strategies to filter out the field data. So we've assembled, like I mentioned, measurements from over 21 individual data sets. These data sets were collected for all sorts of different reasons. Very few of them were collected explicitly for the purpose of being linked to satellite observations like Landsat. And so we are looking at techniques to come up with the best kind of subset of field data that we can use for them. One of the things that we're examining is, for example, the land cover characteristics in the neighborhood around each of the field sites. And so we're using a Sentinel-2 land cover map that the European Space Agency has generated at 10-meter resolution to be able to, in essence, like zoom in just a little bit from the resolution of Landsat. So we can get, 9 land cover classifications within one Landsat pixel. And then we can look for things like water or primarily water. Really, we're looking for water as an effect that could, as a factor that could strongly influence surface reflectance. We're also using Sentinel-2 to look at the spectral heterogeneity within a little neighborhood window around each one of these harvest sites. So if there's, for example, too high of spectral heterogeneity, then it will be more challenging. If there's very high spectral heterogeneity, it'll be more challenging for field measurements to accurately capture those conditions. And so we're still exploring this, but we might jettison some of the field sites if they're too spectrally heterogeneous. And then we'll look at things like the timing of the harvests and the replication of harvests within these field sites to potentially winnow down the field data set further. But even without very much winnowing, we still see that there's, for example, a pretty decent relationship between early summer NDVI and total plant biomass, which is shown in that figure on the right, with each one of the points colored by the locale in which the sample was collected. So here, the field measurements are aggregated up to a site level where each site has multiple individual harvest quadrants. So the relationship is definitely a lot messier than, for example, some of the relationships that I showed earlier on in the presentation. But it's based on a much, much larger sample of observations and still does kind of fit that similar pattern. Now, we have some very preliminary results that Katie generated yesterday. And so I just wanted to share those, but also recognize that this is very much an evolving process. So we are ultimately going to do all the biomass mapping on Earth Engine, but we have extracted out Landsat data for the field sample sites out of Earth Engine and brought it down to our local desktops. And we're using R to run these exploratory analyses and to fit models that we can then bring back into Earth Engine and apply in that environment. So some of the very preliminary results is that we're exploring ways of spatially blocking the field measurements to try to ensure that we are not inflating our estimates of prediction accuracy by comparing models against measurements that are too close to other measurements that were used to train the model. So in essence, trying to account for spatial autocorrelation in developing and validating these models. And so Katie has been exploring some different techniques for this. And I think on the figure on the left, she's kind of blocked up the field sites into using 100-kilometer resolution blocks. So I think in some of the work that Matt did in northern Alaska, they found that vegetation cover was spatially autocorrelated at the scale of like 90 to 100 kilometers. Now, it's hard for us to evaluate what spatial scale we need to take into consideration due to the nature of sampling in our data. In essence, the field data that we've pulled together are really not adequate to evaluate the spatial autocorrelation because of how kind of clustered they are across the Arctic. But if we use kind of a similar 100-kilometer distance, then we get these different blocks. Now, Katie fit a kind of untuned, unenhanced random forest model, and that's shown in the observed versus predicted figure on the right. And just this kind of quick cut of it, she got a model that is doing kind of surprisingly well at predicting plant biomass. The R-squared is pretty low, 0.36, but it is getting a pretty close one-to-one relationship. And it gives me a little bit of confidence that as we further winnow down the field sites to use in the model training validation, and that as we explore other predictors and kind of dial all that in, that we probably will be able to get a decent model for predicting not only total plant biomass, but also shrub plant biomass. Now, we know that there are a lot of sources of error that come into play in trying to come up with estimates of plant biomass. We know that there are field measurement errors. When you go out into the field and you're clipping plant biomass, maybe you clip a little bit too much dead stuff, or you didn't clip the shrub at the moss layer, or you kind of messed up in how you clip out the mosses, right? There's these measurement errors that can occur. There's also field sampling error. When you go into a study site, are your quadrats or your harvest quadrats accurately capturing the spatial variability in biomass that is present at that field site, right? If you have too few harvest plots, it's unlikely that you'll adequately capture the kind of community plant biomass at the scale that the Landsat satellites are seeing. And then we also know that there's things like Landsat measurement error. When it takes a measurement of surface reflectance, those measurements are probably 3 to 8% off, depending on what satellite you're working with. As I showed, there's also these problems with cross-sensor calibration. So there's errors when we try to bring those satellite measurements to match each other. And then there's things like issues with atmospheric corrections. So all of these sources of errors and uncertainty should ideally be accounted for to some extent when modeling biomass across this large domain. And so the way that we are going to try to do this is to propagate some of these errors and uncertainties using Monte Carlo simulations. So instead of just generating one map of plant biomass for the Arctic, instead what we will do is generate maybe 100 maps of plant biomass for the Arctic, where each one of those maps is based on slightly perturbed field and Landsat data, different subsets of data. And then we will, for example, compute the median predicted biomass for each grid cell, as well as a 95%, the 2.5th percentile and 97.5th percentile to get a 95% confidence for each grid cell. And so doing that is very computationally intensive, right? It means that we're not just doing the predictions once, but we have to do them maybe 100 times and store that output as well, which is one of the things that led us also to ask for that resource upload. And then the final objective is that we want to evaluate how plant biomass is distributed across the Arctic. So try to understand, for example, how it changes along climatic gradients, or how it varies among administrative units, like amongst different countries, or amongst national parks, or native land allotments. Like there's all these different administrative units that we'd like to be able to understand how biomass is distributed and has changed across during the last couple of decades. We also want to try to understand where and why biomass changed during this time. So we're going to pull in information about climate norms, trends, perhaps information on permafrost and disturbance dynamics as well. And to get at the where and why, we will probably do some more random forest modeling, where we use this suite of potential driving variables to try to predict the changes in biomass that we saw over the last 2 decades. And then we can look at the variable importance metrics coming out of the random forest models to better understand which factors are contributing to the changes that we see. Now, we envision a bunch of potential applications for these new biomass. We're interested, especially in kind of the ecosystem dynamics. So this project is part of the NASA terrestrial ecology program, and so we're focused on changes in ecosystems. But we can also use it to better understand, for example, tundra carbon stocks, at least in the living plants. And we know that a lot of the carbon in these tundra ecosystems is in the permafrost and it's in roots, but still the above ground carbon stocks are important to understand. And we see that these biomass models could be used also to benchmark prognostic ecosystem models, right? We have colleagues who are increasingly using complex mechanistic models to understand the functioning of terrestrial ecosystems, as well as how they might change and evolve under continued climate warming. But it's really important to calibrate and validate or benchmark these models against observations. And satellite-derived data sets can be really valuable for that benchmarking application. We also think that these new maps could be valuable as input to wildlife habitat maps to understand, where and to what extent wildlife is utilizing northern landscapes, and to help guide sustainable conservation, guide conservation of northern wildlife. And then also just going to be pretty maps. We all like having pretty base maps, and I think that these new data sets could also be used in that regard. So one of the things that I think could be great is to have some kind of interactive data visualization, where we could take these new biomass maps, drape them over 3-dimensional landscapes that have high-resolution satellite imagery as a base layer, and that would enable this kind of fluid zooming and scrolling through the data set. So pulling a couple of figures from the paper that we did back in 2018, we just did this kind of side-by-side comparison. And I took the GeoEye-1 image, threw it over a high-resolution digital elevation model, found the same vantage point through the biomass map of the digital elevation model, and we just kind of like squinted back and forth with them and, said, yeah, they kind of show similar patterns, but it'd be cool if we could actually overlay them and kind of explore and look around at different angles at these biomass data sets to gain a better sense for kind of the distribution and the patterns and how the changes are occurring across these northern lands. I think that would help to foster not only kind of exploratory analyses and new ideas about the utility of these data sets, and really let us kind of capitalize on them to a greater extent. So to wrap this up, we are currently developing this next generation maps of biomass for the Arctic, using this combination of new field measurements and existing field measurements that we're bringing together with Landsat satellite observations. And this has involved extensive collaboration, not only with field ecologists, but also with people who are really good at satellite remote sensing and ecological informatics. I kind of sit in the middle between those. And so it's great to have this larger community helping to guide this effort. And we're really excited to share these new data products with the community and to see how they're used, to encourage their use, because I think that they really are a valuable they will be a valuable new source of information about the Arctic and how it's changed in the last couple of decades. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for your time and acknowledge the support that we've had on this project from the National Science Foundation, but primarily from NASA.